Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. Today's episode is all about diversity, since there are both pale-skinned monsters that crawl and eat and shape, shifting trickster monsters that hide in the woods. I'm ready to tell you some stories about skinwalkers and wendigos. So enjoy and don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Now let's begin. From Boulder Equestrian 9914. Don't hunt horses. Since then, I've lived with them. As far as I can remember, I started riding when I was about 5 years old. I live in Colorado. There are a lot of deer and elk in this part of the countryside, where I used to ride my horse. I've only ever boarded my horses at barns near the backcountry, where there aren't many cars. I would often take my horse Raj out for sunset rides in the large fields behind the barn. During those rides, it was common to see small herds of elk or deer running through the roads on the other side of the fence, or sometimes in the field with us. Nothing unusual. Just the usual evening crowd along with coyotes and red foxes. To be honest, I've been interested in the legends of skinwalkers, wendigos and other cryptids for a long time, but I've never really believed in them. I've never seen or heard of anything like that, and I haven't seen or heard of anything like that either. At least, it's not in my area. Mountain lions and black bears are the most dangerous animals in my part of the state, but they usually stay far away from people, unless you live in the Rocky Mountains. I never worried about being alone in the dark because of this. Horses, which are prey animals, are very sensitive to any kind of danger, so I always felt safe. But late in December, on a night, something happened that will always be in my mind. This took place a long time ago. So, my memory may have filled in some blanks here and there, but there are some things I will never forget. Many of the horses on the farm lived in the dry lot across from the field, including my big black gelding Raja. There were also some larger draft horses living with our smaller quarter horses and Arabians, and because of the size difference, injuries were fairly common. One morning, when I went to the barn as usual, I saw that one of my friend's horses had deep cuts on her chest and shoulders. They looked pretty skinny, and the whole herd looked pretty upset. Some of the other horses still snorted or flicked their tails in alarm. This horse had a bad habit of getting too excited, and I thought she must have run into the barbed wire fence because a small section of it seemed to have fallen down in the wooded part of the dry lot. The vet was called, and she turned out to be fine. But as the days went by, the horses got more and more upset, especially when elk or deer were around. This was strange because they saw them so often when they were walking through the fields. Soon, more horses showed up with the same deep scratches on their haunches, shoulders, and sometimes even their necks as the first horse. We thought for a while that it might have been a cougar or a group of hungry strays. There were a lot of those around. Even so, the wounds never seemed to fit either of them perfectly, which was strange. We never really figured out what was hurting our animals. It made no sense and was very scary at the same time. Late in December, it was a cool night, and I was on my way to the barn to ride my horse. As I drove up the driveway, I passed the dry lot. I saw the horses running around their pen with their tails up and their heads held high. I looked over to see what might have scared them because I was curious about why they were so upset. At first, all I could see was what looked like a deer standing in the middle of the field. It looked like a pretty big buck, which made my car come to a stop. I looked at this deer for a few more seconds before it turned its head and looked right at me. When I saw its face up close, it made my blood run cold. This animal, which I thought was a deer, had two dark eyes that looked forward and was so thin I could see every bone in its body. Yet it was much larger than any deer or even elk I'd ever seen. It looked like it was staring right into my soul, and its face almost looked like it was made of bone. Its front legs were crooked and looked more like dog legs than deer legs. And as I kept looking at it, the cold fear in my veins grew like a cloud of smoke. Everything in me told me to turn around and get out of there as quickly as possible, without any notice. It turned around and ran through the field and up the small hill that led to the road, disappearing into the growing darkness. Since that night, I didn't feel safe keeping my horse at that barn, so I quickly packed up and moved. I was pretty sure that whatever it was that was attacking the horses in the field was that thing, but I hoped I was wrong. I moved barns soon after that, and for a few months I never saw or heard anything like that again. I tried to convince myself that it was probably just an elk with chronic wasting disease, which makes deer and elk lose a lot of weight and look much scarier. But after learning more about crypto, I think what I saw must have been a skinwalker or something similar. Whatever it was, I know for sure that deer shouldn't be hunting horses. I hope I won't go through anything like that again. Now, I try not to go to the barn by myself at night because I don't want to run into something like that. Again, the encounter with the creature happened in Algonquin Park. I'm a teacher from Barry's Bay, Ontario, and since I have the summers off, I spend almost half of each August going on canoe trips in the nearby Algonquin Provincial Park. Most of the park is not wilderness by any means, as there are many logging roads. However, there are many protected areas with no logging or infrastructure, and these are my favourite parts. Some of these protected areas are so big that they are bigger than most other provincial parks. I went to Lake Lavie by myself in August to catch lake trout. Most lake trout spend the summer in deep water, so it wasn't really the right time for them. However, I was going to be busy in the fall, so I thought I'd try jigging in deep water. The trip started at an access point on Lake Obiango, which is a big lake with many branches that is often used as a canoe highway to get to the backcountry. Over the course of a few days, I went from OKC to OK Key and go to Dixon Lake, which is connected to Lake Lavie by one of the longest portages in the park. When you first crossed from Dixon to Lavie, the lake was beautiful. You go into a bay, and as you keep going, it opens up to a huge lake that, to a guy like me who had never seen the ocean, looked like a small sea. This lake is very far into the backcountry. Most of the time, you don't see a lot of other campers. But the only other person there on a canoe trip took my favourite spot on one of the islands, so I decided to try something different. I set up camp at the northernmost part of the lake and went fishing. It was very windy, which made it hard to steer my canoe. This is less of a problem when all my gear is in the boat, but I already had my camp set up. I decided to call it a day early and went back to shore before the wind blew me to the other side of the lake. Then I had a thought. I was close to a much smaller lake to the north of my campsite. A very short portage led from my site to the smaller lake. I got my fishing rod and a few small spinners and headed over there to try to catch some perch or panfish from the shore. At that point it was getting late, so I wouldn't be there for long. I went up the portage and found that it led to a very swampy area. I went around the marsh and back, which took longer than I thought. I started fishing from shore as the sun was going down because it had taken me so long to get there. I buttoned up my flannel because it was getting a little chilly. With the cold wind, the lake was beautiful. The sound of something breaking to my right quickly took away from that beautiful moment. Bears and moose are the only animals that make noises like that when they move. Both are things you don't want to mess with. The problem was that this animal was between me and the rest of the shoreline, which would have led me back to the marsh, the portage, and my campsite. I decided that to get to the shore of Lavie, I would have to cut through the thick forest. To get to my camping spot, I was glad I had my flashlight with me because it was getting dark. I went into the woods, and after about 15 seconds, I heard that animal again. I stopped dead in my tracks and stopped talking. I heard it keep going for a second before stopping. When I kept going, it kept going with me. But when I stopped, so did it. At this point, I was scared to death. I turned on my flashlight and shined it behind me, but I didn't see any eyes shining back. I was just there with my flashlight, I swear. After that, I started to walk faster and shine my light back every few steps for the next 2 minutes. I was a little scared because I didn't want to be eaten by what I thought was a mountain lion or a bear. I finally tried yelling at it to scare it away. I turned around and yelled as loud as I could as if I were calling out to someone. When I yelled back off, it was in my own voice. My whole world fell apart. After that, I saw a white head with no ears and big eyes peek out from behind a tree. I ran as fast as I could through the woods to get away from it until I got back to the water. I ran along the shore to the left until I got to my campsite. I threw everything I owned into my canoe as quickly as I could. I just threw my tent, sleeping bag, and everything else inside it into the canoe. I got my backpack and water filter and put them in as well. I got in the boat and paddled as quickly as I could, but I forgot to get my bare hang. I honestly didn't know where I was going, but every part of me to just leave. I was sitting in my canoe in the middle of the lake, and it was completely dark. Most of what I was thinking about now was what had happened that night. I didn't sleep. I stayed in my canoe and waited until morning. I had the nerve to go back to my campsite, quickly grab my beer hang, and canoe across the lake to the other side of the lake, where I would fold and put away my gear the right way. Believe me when I say I'm never going to camp on Lake Levier again. My grandmother's skin was taken from maple by something. Just over a year ago, my dad took my siblings and me to our cabin in the woods. While we were there, we went boating, squatting, and playing badminton, and we had a great time. Move along. A few days before the end of our trip, I started to feel scared and paranoid, like something bad was going to happen. I think it might have had something to do with the fact that we talked about skinwalkers there, and I remembered later that saying the word skinwalker, or talking about them, is supposed to bring them closer to you. I told my grandma I was scared, and she laughed and told me I was being silly. I insisted that something might be in the woods with us, but she told me not to talk about it, especially since I was so scared. At 6 o'clock, we were still in the woods. I was in the room where we were staying. I didn't want to play board games with the rest of the group, so I just sat there and looked out the window. When I saw it, it was then. It looked like my grandmother, but it wasn't quite right. Her arms were too long and went down to her knees, and she seemed to be taller than my real grandma, who is really short. This wrong-looking version of my grandma was just wandering around aimlessly in the woods. Then I saw her walk over to the shed and just stand there, not moving at all. I was shocked. I felt compelled to keep watching, but when I heard someone laughing in the kitchen, I woke up. I followed everyone back into the kitchen. My grandmother was putting wine in a glass. I asked my grandma what she was doing outside and how she got in so quickly, but she gave me a confused look and said she had been inside the whole time. I had a sudden feeling of dread. I ran back to that window to look outside, and my younger sister followed me to see what was going on. As we walked together to the window, we saw a person run into the woods. We both agreed that it would be best not to talk about it because no one would believe us. I'm not sure what it was, but I think it was a skinwalker. I said its name so many times that it looked like my grandmother, but it still couldn't get it right. This is the first time I've told this story. You can call me crazy, but I want to go back to that cabin. I'm curious to know what it was. I'll even try to get my family to buy cameras so I don't have to see it in person. But now I know not to say skinwalker out loud in the middle of the woods. There's something like a skinwalker in Finland. Captain Stark told me about it last November or December, so it's been about a year. I was about to go camping. I left early in the morning because during the winter in Finland, the sun doesn't rise, so I only had a few hours of light before it got completely dark. I took my hunting knife, my hunting rifle, and a gas can with me when I left. At first, about 20 kilometers in, I just rode around in the woods. I could smell this awful smell. It made me gag. Even though I hunted moose every year and had found many dead animals in the past, I had never smelled anything so bad. I looked for the source of the smell, but I couldn't find it. As I kept walking, the smell went away, and I tried not to think about it until I got to my campsite a few hours later. I checked the gas in my snowmobile after setting up camp. It was almost out of gas, so I started filling it with the extra gas can I had brought. It was getting colder and darker, so I started a fire and laid down to rest. A small clearing was where I decided to camp. If there was enough light, I could see pretty well all around me. I was surrounded by thick woods, but I could only see about 200 m away from camp when it got dark. My fire was going out, so I ran to the edge of the woods to get some firewood and kindling to bring back to camp. I was able to keep my fire going, but that smell was back. I wanted to leave because the smell was so bad, but it was too dark and cold now, and if I didn't keep an eye on the trail, I would get completely lost. So I decided it was best to stay where I was and deal with the smell. I noticed that this smell was getting worse over time. When it stopped getting worse, I quickly took my headlamp out of my bag and put it on. As I looked over the nearby woodline, my heart sank when I heard the voice of my cousin, who should have been 100 km away. As I kept looking around, I noticed a red eye at the edge of the ones. Then I decided to pack up and leave, but right before I could start the snowmobile, I heard fast, frantic footsteps in the snow, and something pulled me off the snowmobile. It started pulling me into the woods with a lot of force. I had a knife on my belt, so I took it and started stabbing at the thing's hand until I hit something and it let go of me. At the same time, a horrible scream that sounded like a mix of a woman and an elk filled the air. I still had my headlamp on, so I looked at what I thought was running away from me. It looked like a half-rotten wolf. I was completely shocked. Even though it had only been pulling me for a few seconds, it had already pulled me quite far into the ones. I started to run toward the snowmobile. I pulled on the cord when I made it, hoping it would start, and it did. I ran away. I was going a little too fast, and about half of my things flew off the snowmobile. I still had my rifle, but I was going too fast on that small trail, and I started to hear more screaming around me, as if there were more than one of those things. Even worse, they seemed to be keeping up with the snowmobile. I had to be going about 80 kilometers per hour. I got to a long straight part of the trail, so I turned the gas to full, grabbed my rifle, and shot at one of the screaming people I saw in the woods. I was hoping to hit one, but I don't think I did. The screaming just stopped at one point, but I kept driving home, and it took me about an hour to get there. I ran inside and shut and locked every door and window. I think I eventually fell asleep, because I remember waking up the next morning at 10:26. I picked up my gun from the ground and went outside to make sure everything was okay. I took a look at my snowmobile. Then I found a piece of pure black hair stuck on the hook at the back of it. And on the back, I saw these huge claw marks. I started walking back to my house and saw that my front door had similar claw marks. I brought these things home with me, but where were they now? They know my address. But thankfully, I haven't seen, heard, or even smelled them since then. People in Finland aren't supposed to have skinwalkers or wendigos, so I haven't told anyone about this. Every time I hear my cousin's voice, I remember this scary trip all over again. I don't hunt as much as I used to, and I've moved closer to Rovaniemi, the closest city. I still haven't been to the forest. That trip gave me a lot of nightmares. Skinwalker at Scout Hall from NG. Foxy 666. When I was 10, my friend Joe and I did scouts. Joe and I once went to the Scout Hall for a sleepover with video games. All the other kids ate pizza and drank soda, but Joe and I played in the corner. Joe was my best friend, even though we didn't have the same interests. Even though it got dark, we still got along. People started to watch a movie. I honestly can't remember what movie we were watching, because Joe and I were mostly just whispering to ourselves in our own little corner. Soon we got up and went to get some pizza and soda. I only ate a few pieces of pizza because it always made me feel sick. About 30 minutes later, I started to feel sick. So I got up and asked Joe if he would come outside with me to keep me company while I got some cool night air. Now, our scout hall was a small wooden cabin near some trees. Nearby, there was a highway and a stream. That night, Joe and I went out the back door to get some fresh air. The back door faced the forest. It was very cold, but also nice and cool. We stood outside and talked while looking into the forest. Joe told me something about our friend, a girl who lives on his street and was my best friend in elementary school. He just stopped in the middle of what he was doing. Then he whispered or yelled, "Did you see that?" he asked. He pointed to the 3 trees that were very close to each other and said, "That's what I asked you." I squinted, looked really closely, and waited about 15 seconds before I finally saw it. A pale shadow darted from tree 3 to tree 1. How could that be? I was shocked and couldn't believe what I was hearing. Then it happened again. It went from tree 12 to tree 2 and back again. "You didn't see any order at that time, right?" Joe asked again. "Yeah, I did. We should go back into the house. If we stay out here too long, we might get into trouble." I said, "Joe agrees with you," but I didn't take my eyes off the 3 trees. We were both at the top of our scout unit, and the leaders would call us if they really needed us or if we weren't supposed to be somewhere. The rest of that night was quiet, and everyone went to sleep except for Joe and me. We stayed up and talked quietly about our lives until everyone else fell asleep. Back then, we lived about 1 km apart, and it took about 15 minutes to walk from his house to mine, but it seemed like we could talk for hours and hours. Then, at 11:36, we heard someone knocking. It was more like tapping long fingernails in a rhythmic pattern every few seconds. Tap, 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 tap at the window across from us, pausing for a second between each one. From across the street, we could see the outline of a humanoid shape near the window. It was almost like something out of a horror movie. After about 30 minutes of just lying there is still a rock in our sleeping bags in the hallway as we look at each other with scared faces. It ended. Then we heard what could only be described as 4 bare feet stomping around, but there was no blood-curdling scream. We were both frozen in shock, fear, and disbelief for about 10 minutes. Joe asked me what that thing was, but I didn't know. I just couldn't say anything. I was crying, and all I wanted was for my parents or someone else to get me out of this place. When I finally got my voice back, I tried to talk, but at that moment we heard something coming from the forest. I think the scream came from the stream. It was so loud and far away that neither of us could fall asleep. The Search for Things from Daniel 7. In August of the year 2021, I started hanging out with Nick and Belle, 2 guys my age. One day we decided to ride our bikes to a graveyard near their house. We got off our bikes when we got to the graveyard, which was after 5 minutes. We were the only ones there, and it was daytime. Nick and Belle went over to sit on the grave of a random person from the 1800s. I told them it was rude and that they should get off the grave and show respect, but they said they didn't care and laughed about how they were going to hell. After that, though, they made things worse, beginning to jump on the graves. I had a bad feeling about all of this, and I had the sudden feeling that someone was watching me from the corner of the graveyard as they played carelessly on the gravestone. I told them that I needed to go back home. I didn't like how I felt, and that was the end of that. When it was October, we started to look inside abandoned houses in the area. When we got tired of that, we would play Tell the Truth or Take a Dare. In the middle of the night, we even did some 3 a.m. We found challenges on Google, which I'm very sorry about. Chris, who was Belle's brother, was a very interesting person. He used to talk to me a lot about ghosts, legends, and myths, but I didn't really believe him when he said they were real. In December, Belle, his brother, and I got together on the trailer's back deck one night. The brother of Belle, Chris, told us about a word that the native people used to call skinwalkers to their place. He told one of us to go into the woods and say the word out loud, but we were all too scared to do it. So I said, "Why don't we all say the word at the same time?" We did, and as soon as we did, I felt a chill go all over my body. We stood on the back deck and listened for sounds. Suddenly, we heard what sounded like me and Belle talking in the woods. This made us run back into the house and lock the door behind us. After that, it was a Tuesday night in November. We were on our way to get my mum's car so that she could drive to work the next day. She was tired, so she went to stay with a friend, so we offered to help her get it. She gave us permission to go and the keys, and my friends and I left. We got to her car, and I got in, put the key in the ignition, and started the car. I pulled out of the driveway and went to the woods near the house to pick up my friends. We went around the block and turned onto a back road where the speed limit was 45 mph. I was going almost 70 for some reason. But as we were driving, I saw 3 deer on the side of the road. These deer were acting very strangely. When one ran in front of the car, I almost hit it. But as this was going on, it seemed like time was moving slowly. The deer that ran in front of us seemed normal, but the small one on the side of the road was strange. I saw it stand up on its 2 back legs, and I swear I saw it change from a deer into what looked like a blonde girl with sharp teeth. We ran to the house and called it a night. After that, in February 2022, the weather started to change from winter to spring. Chris and I decided to go to the nearest field to see if we could see the thing that's been following me on camera. I brought a knife, a baseball bat, and a GoPro with me. Chris, on the other hand, had a BB gun in a cheap headlamp. We were soon in the field across the road. We went into this bush and chose a place to hide while we waited. After a few minutes, we seemed to have found what we were looking for. We tried to find it. I'll never forget what I went through that night. We were sitting in some bushes under some trees when we heard what sounded like 20 deer running around us, as if they were being chased. Then, when that noise stopped, we heard what sounded like a big bird flapping its wings above the trees. While we were listening, I pointed out that something was coming at us from deeper in the woods. I said that we could hear branches breaking and trees being pushed over. Chris and I were so scared that we ran out of there as fast as we could. As soon as we came out of the woods, all the sounds stopped. There was no noise in the woods. Before we got there, We decided to call it a night and go back to the house. As we left the field, I looked back up into the trees and saw 4 glowing orange eyes looking back at us. Chris told us to pretend we hadn't seen anything. We were walking down the street when I turned around and saw a woman in a dirty white dress when I looked back. Chris stopped to look when I told him about it, and as we watched, the woman in the white dress screamed and ran toward us. Luckily, we made it back to the house without getting hurt. Who knows what would have happened if it had caught us? My dad saw a skinwalker from Silver Bullet 54. Even though he's 60, my dad is still about 6 feet tall and weighs between 202 and 720. He's a real man's man. He went to the USMC. He worked at a prison and wasn't afraid of much, except for death and God. He also used to think that everything supernatural and paranormal was a bunch of nonsense, but his trip to Dayton, Ohio, changed his mind. Since traffic is one of the things he hates, he decided to stop at the first place he could get away from people. He got out a horse blanket and a pillow, curled up in the back of his truck and went to sleep. It was a warm, clear night, so sleeping was very relaxing. He was startled out of his sleep when something hit the side of his truck. He set himself up and started looking around, but he didn't find anything. 3 nights in a row this happened. He would pull over in a quiet place, sleep for a while, and then be woken up when something hit his truck. He took out a camera and tripod he had with him and set them up right next to the left side of his truck. Since all of the bumps were coming from there, at 4 a.m. he hit the record button and went to sleep. When he woke up, he checked his camera. He kept looking for hours, but he didn't see anything until 3:30 a.m. He could only see what looked like 2 feet walk up to his truck stop, stand still for a minute, and then walk away. The weird thing is that it was only feet. There were no legs, knees, hips, torso, or arms. On his last day, he looked around the area but didn't find anything strange. He stayed up all night because he wanted to know what the heck was going on at 1:15 a.m. and drank Monster energy drinks. Something was walking toward his truck and he heard it. He looked up and saw something that sounds even worse than anything else I've seen myself. He said it was at least 10 feet tall and had red eyes and black hair or fur. He was sure he was dreaming. So for a moment he shut his eyes tightly and then opened them. He thought the thing was right in front of him. He thought that if he turned around and looked at the right side of the truck behind him, that thing would be standing there and staring at him. So instead of turning, he sat still until the sun came up. Then, when he got back home, he took tail out of there. He told me I should never, ever go to Dayton. Still, I have never been to Dayton. His experience does intrigue me. What did he see? Does it still exist? What did it mean to this day? None of those questions have been answered yet. Those are not my Edo custom friends. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, and 3 of my online friends, Chad, Josh, and Emily, were coming from Cleveland, Ohio. Chad and Emily were cousins, and their grandparents lived nearby. They were coming over for the weekend, and since Josh lived nearby and also wanted to hang out with us on Saturday, they decided to bring him along. Like I usually do when I don't have homework, I was playing Oculus Quest. I don't go outside much in the winter, and I mostly play video games because it's like a break for me. Cross-country season ended about a month and a half ago, and this spring I'll be running track. My dad and sister were in the living room watching Christmas movies, and I was in the basement. I was playing a game when my phone let me know that I had a message. I thought about who it might be. I walked over to my phone and didn't know who it was. I had forgotten that my friends would be here, and I usually forget to add contacts to my phone, but the text said, "We're at the door. Come on out." I was confused, so I went upstairs and looked out the window. When I saw them, I opened the door and came out to greet them. Then we just talked and played around as we walked around the neighborhood. I usually talked to them on Discord and FaceTime, so it felt strange. It was fun to hang out and finally meet Josh. I met him a year ago, and we've been friends ever since. I'd met Chad a few times before, so it wasn't as strange as meeting Josh for the first time. Chad is probably one of my best friends. I've known him since I was 10 years old. We broke up a few weeks before this, but we're still friends, so it was awkward to see Emily again. We talked and hung out together until 8:30 p.m. After that, they had to go eat dinner. I went home, and about an hour later, I went for a run. Now, I don't like going on runs, but my dad makes me do it. That's when things began to get strange. When I was almost done with my 2.5-mile run, I was happy with my time and almost beat my personal best. I was walking up the driveway when I saw a dark figure at the bottom of the hill in my backyard, which leads to the woods. It looked like the person was about 6 feet tall. I thought at first that Josh was 6 feet tall. I said, "Hey," to him. Then I stopped moving, and the shadowy figure's arms and legs started to twist, and I heard a loud cracking sound. It sounded a bit like when you keep cracking your knuckles. I ran for the door right away and locked it behind me. I remember getting cramps all of a sudden because I had just finished running. So my quick run to the door made my chest and legs hurt, and my heart felt like it was going to burst. When my dad came up to me, he asked if I was done running. I told him I was, and went up to my office and sat down at my computer. Look, I didn't want to tell him about the thing in the backyard because it would sound so strange. So I played video games with two of my other friends, Ben and Seth, to take my mind off of it. We stayed up until about 2:00 in the morning, online games. I did tell them what happened, but they didn't believe me, as you might expect. After that, I went to bed, and I didn't wake up for a few hours. The only strange thing that happened that night was a bird hit my window. That morning, my dad and sister had to go somewhere. I have no idea what it was. I didn't really pay attention because I was still thinking about what had happened the night before. My friends came back about 20 minutes later. I explained what had happened. And to my surprise, they believed me. Chad then told me about something else that happened in my backyard. Chad was over about 2 years ago. We were looking for an albino squirrel together in my backyard. My dad said that he saw us looking for a few hours before we found it. We saw this squirrel when we were blown away. We've never seen anything like it. A white squirrel with red eyes that looked like tiny red buttons. When the squirrel saw us, it didn't run away. Instead, it just stared at us. Then something crazy happened. Before it fell off the tree, its head just kept turning and turning. We looked where it hit the ground, but there was only blood and no squirrel. I thought it was really strange. It seemed more like a dream when I thought about it, but when Chad brought it up, it all came back to me so clearly. But Emily didn't at all believe that. We planned to play a virtual reality game with each other later. Josh and Chad went to get their virtual reality, VR, headset. Emily asked me to show her where I saw the figure in the shadows. I took her out back and showed her where I saw it. She went to the edge of the woods to see if she could see it herself. It was scary to think that it was still out there. I thought it was odd, but I went with her anyway. She followed us, and we walked until we met Josh and Chad. That was strange, because I had just seen them going home to get their headsets. All of them just looked at me. When their mouths slowly started to open more and more, it scared me. So I looked at their teeth. They weren't normal. They were too rough and sharp, more like needles than teeth. "Jack, come on," Josh said to me in the strangest voice I've ever heard him use. "We want to show you something." I told Emily that we needed to run, and we both did. The air was filled with a loud, painful scream. We heard them running after us, but their feet sounded more like horse hooves. Just as we got to the top of the hill, Josh and Chad came back. At first I was scared, but I knew it was them when I saw that they were startled by us. I told them what Emily and I had seen. I looked back down at what I thought were Chad and Josh before they just stood there in the woods and stared at us. When I looked at the real Josh and Chad, they were frozen with fear. The monsters did not catch their attention. All eyes were on me, Jack. "What do you mean you were with Emily? She hasn't come." I froze. "Who was in the woods with me?" When I went back to where Emily was, I couldn't find her. When I turned around and looked down at those things, she was standing right next to them. I saw her head start to turn the same way that squirrels did. A few years ago, we ran into my house and locked the door as fast as we could. I started to wonder who I had been talking to. If Emily had not been here, Josh and Chad were also talking to her, so I know it wasn't just me. But when I asked them about it, they said it was just the three of us out there. When we looked back out the window, we could see them running back into the woods. When we thought it was safe, we walked back to Chad's grandparents' house nearby, just in case Josh got a knife. When she got there, Emily brought Starbucks back with her. She looked at us like she didn't know what was going on. "Why do you guys look like you saw a ghost?" She did, even scarier than a ghost. "We told you." We saw things that seemed to be her, Josh and Chad. The way she answered almost made me throw up. Well, to be honest, I'm pretty sure I saw someone who looked exactly like you, Chad, but they were way too tall, and their face looked like it had been burned. As we drove home, this person looked at me through the car window. After hearing that, Chad's face got even paler, and they left a little early because of it. Since these things happened, I've talked to them a few times, and we've tried to tell our other friends, but no one really believes us, except for a friend named Adam, who says he saw something similar, something that looked just like his little brother. We haven't told anyone else about what we saw. Josh, Adam and I looked into it more a few days ago, and we think what we saw might have been a skinwalker, but we can't be sure with something like this hunted from Country Rebel. This is an old story that my grandfather told me long before I was born, but he gave me some background about it one night. He lives in the woods with my grandmother in Washington State. My parents and I go see them every so often. My grandpa is a country guy and a good storyteller, among other things. I always loved hearing what he had to say. On a fall weekend, we went to their house to see them. We always talked about how things are going and about things we used to do. My grandpa would sit in his chair outside at night. This night was no different, except that he was staring into the woods as if something was out there. I asked, "What comes to mind?" He sighed and then asked me in his son's old southern accent, "You believe in things you can't explain. I don't know of any. Why?" "Well, I did something long ago before you were even born. I think now is a good time to tell you this story." He was very serious when he said this. "Okay, I'm listening," I said, a little bit excited. Then he began to tell his story. It started when he went into the woods alone to hunt for 5 days. He had everything he would need for the trip in his bag. His favorite weapon was a rifle with a lever on the side. When everything was ready, he gave his grandmother a kiss and drove to his hunting spot. He swore that he saw shadows in the trees as he drove through those woods. Not just any shadows, but strange figures that looked like people. He brushed it off because he thought it was a group of hikers. Grandpa knows the wilderness like the back of his hand. Once he got to his spot, he set up camp and started walking through the brush to look for deer, elk, or moose tracks. So he wasn't afraid of getting lost. Several hours of walking and talking on the phone. Nothing got through. At that point, he started to feel like he wasn't the only one out there. He noticed that the birds and bugs were suddenly quiet, and he knew that when the woods were quiet, a big predator was nearby. He thought it could have been a bear, a pack of wolves, or a cougar. He stood still for a few minutes, but no one came by. As the sun started to go down, he started walking back to his camp. He made it back home in the end, roasted some marshmallows, and then went to sleep. He went back to the woods the next day and picked up where he left off. Not long after that, he came across the entrance to a cave. He didn't go in because he thought there might be a bear in there. So he kept hiking for a while. After a while, he smelled what he said was rotting flesh and muck. He felt like throwing up. Then that feeling of no longer being alone came back. He kept walking to get away from the smell and feeling, but he could still smell that horrible smell. No matter where he went, the smell seemed to follow him. Then he told me that he started to see things moving in the trees. He got his gun ready just in case, but then everything went quiet and he heard what sounded like low talking. He finally figured out that it was saying his name John, but the voice sounded more like his grandmother Jess. He got back to her. "Help me," it said. "I'm hurt." My grandfather was scared and didn't know what to do. He swears that something hard hit the back of his head at that moment. He lost consciousness for a moment, and when he woke up, it was pitch black all around him. He quickly rushed to get his phone. At the very least, the light from the phone's screen would help. He felt like he was surrounded by sharp rocks. He was in a cave, and his head was hurting. As he crawled along the ground, trying to see as much as he could through his phone screen, his eyes slowly got used to the dark. Then he hit something with his hand. At first, he thought it was just another rock, but this one felt smooth, and when he picked it up, he almost screamed when he realized it wasn't a rock, but a human skull. He started to look around and search more. He found a huge number of bones, both animal bones and human bones. He had never been so scared before. He then heard a screeching sound. It didn't sound like a man, only partly the rest of that scream sounded like an elk. He was so scared he needed to find a way to defend himself. Luckily, he found his rifle. He grabbed it and hid behind a large outcrop in the side of the cave. He began to hear heavy footsteps approaching the cave. He took out his phone, trying to make out what it was. Then he saw it. It was no ordinary animal. He described it as looking human, but whatever it was appeared to have not eaten in months. He could see its bones through its skin. Its arms and legs were so long and thin. It had hands like a man, but its fingers ended in claws. He swears he saw something like a bony tail. As for its head, that looked more like a deer skull, with sharp canines at the front of its jaw and human-like teeth at the end of it. There were antlers on its head running down its back, and its eyes seemed to glow in the darkness. He had no words to describe what he was feeling. Then the thing spotted him soon enough, and my grandpa fired at it. The creature began to screech in pain. It jumped on him, pinning him to the ground and opening its maw. That horrible smell came out of it. My grandpa then latched onto one of its large fangs and yanked until the thing came out. With one rapid movement, Grandpa stabbed the thing in the eye with its own thing. It fell backwards, but my grandpa followed through, jabbing the thing more and more until it stopped moving. Only then did he breathe a sigh of relief. He made his way slowly and steadily to the entrance of the cave. Then he made his way back to camp, packing everything and making his way home. When he got back, my grandma saw him in a complete mess. She tended to his injuries. While my grandpa told her everything, she was in shock. When he finished telling his story to me, I asked him, "Woo, so he really killed it?" He then pulled something from his pocket. This is all I brought back with me that day," he said. He gave it to me and told me that was its fang. "Well, did you ever find out what it was?" I wondered. "Well, son, I did learn its name. Some folks call it the Wendigo, and I'm not the only one who encountered one poor souls who were unfortunate became victims of that creature." He answered surprisingly. I believed him. "Word of advice to you. Don't go following voices in the woods, especially the ones you know, and listen to your instincts, because it might as well save your life." "You hear me?" I nodded quickly after hearing my grandpa's story. I had many thoughts running through my mind. But if I find myself in the woods, I'm going to recall that advice: never follow the voices, follow my instincts, understand that I'll never know if I'm being hunted myself.